welcome to our podcast. I have David McGiffert with me here, whom we had the pleasure of talking to last year. And since then, David has written Best Seat in the House, a wonderful book about filmmaking and being with people and being human, I think, is another part of what that book is about. And you've recently done an Audible. The first question I have is, what was it like reading your own book out loud for that process?
Excruciating at first. I hated my voice. I'd never done anything like that. That's why I did an audiobook. I mean, the idea of me being presumptive enough to think I'd sell a lot of audiobooks is a joke. But what wasn't a joke was my publisher said, you should try doing an audiobook. The thought had never occurred to me. I thought that's something I'd like to experience. I've never experienced anything like that before. It took me on and off 10 months because a friend of mine, when he heard, I was telling him that I'd been asked to do an audiobook. He said, oh, I know a guy who does audiobooks for a living. Let me introduce you to him. Well, the guy turned out to be a mentor that I couldn't, you would only wish for and never get. He made me practice for 2 months. And then at the end of 2 months, he said, okay, you're ready. He would have me send him files. He said, don't worry about the background sound. Don't worry about I want to listen to your speaking voice. And he would send me back these very intelligent and beautifully crafted notes that made me actually be able to understand what these little adjustments he wanted me to make. And then I began editing my own stories too before I sent them to him, where he would put them in the form for the right form for an audiobook. And then I sent it off to my publisher. It came out March 26th. I hope it may be a verbal sleeping pill. I'm not sure. My voice is is very calm. I'm not an actor. I didn't try to be an actor. It's kind of like this, and maybe not even as animated as this, but I've gotten very nice feedback from people that whose opinion I respect. But it's a very odd undertaking.
What makes a perfect reading of a book by the author as opposed to anybody else?
Well, I think that in itself, I'm told, is a pull for people if they even know the author. I mean, many people, they have no idea who I am, which is fine. But the other thing I learned was that if I could speak the way you and I are talking, and I didn't, but that was my aim the whole time, and I would get going a little quick. I don't like the pacing in a lot of it. I think it could have been just a pinch better, but a lot of people like an audiobook that goes rather quickly without all the pregnant pauses and the dramatic stuff. And I didn't make it like that. I mean, if I was talking about Milos Forman every once in a while, I'd sort of half imitate his voice because it was very fun to imitate. But in general, I think the biggest thing that I learned was to make it conversational. But I write differently than I talk. So there was a big adjustment that had to be made. But it was just a wonderful and interesting process. I'll never do it again, I'm sure.
Any revelations for you reading back what you'd written all that while ago and reconsidering or thinking about your memoir?
Well, I did add 4 stories on the audiobook that I'd written after I published the book, just things that came to me that I remembered. I mean, I'm getting to the point now where I'm thinking to myself, I'm very glad I wrote the book when I did, because those stories don't come to me as easily as they did when I first started writing in 2012. It took me 8 years, off and on writing. So I'm a slow study. But no, it made me, again, miss the people I worked with. And I think the other revelation that came as I read through the stories again was that the degree to which the film industry has changed. It's actually pretty bad right now for people who do what I do and crew people in general. The business is not what it was. The streaming companies and stuff have changed the whole pentagram of how the work is done, what the pay ranges are, the work hours. I mean, there are business people running film, and a business template over a film doesn't work well. It just doesn't.
It's one of the things we discussed on the last interview. We touched on it, and you said you were kind of glad you got out when you got out because of the corporate nature that is kind of poisoning the business and the methods of working. And it's not shown any signs of getting any better anytime sooner. And AI coming into the picture in the insidious way is not much of a help either. Have you had any discussions about that with anybody? How it's going
Well,
to affect people?
I haven't discussed with too many people because I don't talk to too many people who are in film now, but it's a big deal. I just heard that Bob Zemeckis has a film coming out with Tom Hanks and the girl who is married to Sean Penn, who was in Princess
Robin
Bride.
Wright?
Yeah. And in it, he uses AI to have them go through their whole age range. And apparently he carries it off beautifully. He's been talking about it for 2.5, 3 decades about the being able to, that process is coming. He's been into it for really a long time. I remember him talking about it on the Back to the Futures. But now apparently he's done a feature that's going to come out that's really quite good using AI. But on its face, it's going to be a death knell. I think if they allow it to come into film the way, I mean, the many ways it can come in, it's going to change everything. And I don't think anybody can predict how it's going to change, but it's not going to be for the better.
The recent legislation is not enough really to keep it in check and watch people's
Absolutely
phones.
not. No, it's not.
I saw one article. I can't remember the creative person, but they were going to build huge studio spaces in Atlanta, and then the fear of the current trend in AI, they said, "No, I'm not going to risk that."
I mean, the thing about filmmaking as a profession is the people. I mean, yes, the creativity, yes, the finished product, but the experience of having 150 people trying to mount the same creative idea, each from their own professional and personal investment in doing their part, is an exquisite experience, even the bad ones, because you constantly are learning things. You constantly are being educated by the people around you. You're learning about human nature. You're learning about an artistic craft. I mean, and a lot of that now, yes, it's all in there, but the business overlay, the for-profit overlay, the watching the time spent, making sure that every buck is going to show up in the profit. It doesn't work. And I think I told you, I used to go before I got so busy with this dumb audiobook. I was invited to go to a meeting that goes on every week with a group of assistant directors and production managers. And they're all kids in their, late 20s, 30s, and 40s. They're on fire. They're so bright. They're so enthusiastic. They're people you'd want to be friends with. They're funny. They're involved. They care about what they're doing. They love other people, and they can't get work. Their careers have hit a wall, and this pandemic and then the strike really, really hurt a lot of people. There are many costume houses, prop houses, electrical houses, with the lights and everything, that are going dark because there's no business, and they can't survive. They've got an overhead, they've got equipment, so that's one part of it. And they're not mounting a lot of shows. They had these all these strikes last year that got a lot of the conditions, at least pay-wise and hours-wise, somewhat better. But what it actually did was wind up sending a lot of business overseas where it's cheaper.
Yeah, which is par for the course these days.
Yeah. So in one sense, they made gains, and in another sense, it exacerbated the problem, which is lack of work.
So business getting pushed abroad, and as you pointed out, AI for makeup now is a big deal, and that's for quite a extravagant job of aging someone and making it look real. But now they can use AI to do ordinary makeup.
Oh, absolutely. The AI scenery there, and they have, these LED background screens that they can project anything. You see it all the time on this little Star Wars thing that they do for television. They're unbelievable, So it seems to behoove from businesses to do it from a profit sense. You don't have to hire certain people. You can control a lot of in post-production, supposedly. I don't really pretend to know a lot about how AI works, but I do know that it cuts down jobs for sure. And I don't know that it makes films that much better. That's the thing. Because if you don't have a story, if you don't have a good story, it doesn't matter how much AI or how much anything you have.
Well, see, this is the scary thing, is they were trying to say AI can do the story as well.
Mm-hmm.
But when you were in the business, did you not find the changes in the technology were increasing with green screen and what way digital formats were being used? Did you not see it not see it coming, but aware of a sudden speed up in the process of how?
Yes. Yeah. And then of course, once you had a blue screen or a green screen, then your tendency was to do something, that it utilized that. So that was going on. But really what I saw was a change in the business pentagram of how they were doing it. That's the thing that made me uncomfortable. There were businesses coming in, people coming in from a business world, wanting to run a studio, come up with projects and oversee projects, who had absolutely no grounding in cinema.
Has that always been the case to some degree?
Not as much. No. I mean, there were people, you remember the guys who started the studios and stuff. I mean, the echoes of that were still there, the studio system, when I started in the early 70s. The studio system was very much in evidence still. And what happened during the 35 or 40 years that I was in the business was that studio system gradually faded and was taken over more by business people. I mean, I'm being simplistic, but you could see it. And the people would come to work in suits when I started. People had this amazing pride, and it was just in them as people. It wasn't something that was showy or anything. I mean, this was just the way you did it. You came to work, dressed well, you spoke well, you treated problems well, you were collaborative. And the collaboration part, of course, is always there and is the best part of filmmaking for a person working on a set. But the business part, overhead, the way people wanted projects run, what they wanted in their stories when they saw you taking a tack that they didn't think would sell, rather than, wait a minute, but this is a creative through line that makes a story go. It didn't exist to the depth, I think, of what people would do with film knowledge earlier. I don't know if that makes sense, but it didn't seem to be that way. I mean, you'd have people come onto the set who were called associate producers and have a country clue what was going on. I'll give you an example. This was in the late 80s, and an associate producer came to me on a show. He said, let's make a shot list for this afternoon about all the shots that the director needs to get things finished, and then we'll know how we're doing. And that's not at all It doesn't work because what happens on the third shot, if you don't get it on the timetable that you put down, then the guy comes to you and goes, you know, we're behind schedule.
It's time and motion thinking.
Yeah, and they don't understand that. Yeah, you spend much more time on the third shot you want to do, but you do shot 4, 5, and 6 a lot faster than you planned for because that's just how the creative process goes on films. I mean, that's a small thing, but I mean, when you multiply things like that out onto an overall film project, it isn't the same.
Do you think the first AD even exists the same way as they would have a few years ago? Is that job changing with the way the system is changing, or in danger of?
No, I don't. I think the responsibilities are the same. I think in television you become more an arm of the producing side as opposed to the directing side, so that you do you have more an involvement of staying on schedule as opposed to let's get the shot that works for the story. And in film, I suppose there's some of that. It is more of a business thing, but they're still, I mean, these kids that I would go and have coffee with, there'd be 35 people there, all doing what I did, you know, asking me questions about, well, you know, how did you do this kind of thing? And to me, they were far more qualified than I was. They were far brighter. They knew much more about what they were doing. And their love was making a film crew mesh and work well. That's what they liked doing.
What you described there is almost an it factor to making a really good AD. Not everyone has that. Not how everyone has that way of being able to be the catalyst for everybody. That's not a straightforward skill. I don't think you can teach it. I think there's a humanity there that is required.
I agree with you. That's why I like these people, because their personalities were geared to being that way. I mean, we were talking earlier about our nature is to please, you know, and I think in a kind of loose, abstract way that applies to assistant directing. What you're trying to do is tamp down the tension, tamp down any conflict, and get everybody moving in the same direction and having a good time. Maybe having a good time isn't the key thing, but if that comes into it, you've got something potent.
Well, that
works.
They certainly shouldn't be having a bad time.
No, I agree. And yeah, it isn't party time. That's not what a good time means in that context. It just means you know you're doing something the best that you can do it, and the people that you're working with. Look, films always want to make a profit. That's obviously the case. But it's the way they go about it now is just different. It just isn't couched in the movie context. It's couched in the business context. I don't know how else to define them, but they are different.
Yeah. The business of making it is getting in the way of making it.
Yes. Well, I agree with that completely. And it's sad because, I mean, as I said, there are a lot of really talented film people out there, television people too. I mean, I use them interchangeably. It's the same business to me, but somehow the Netflix, Apple, pentagram, or however it is that they run their business, is not conducive to making the creative side, the side that is on the side of the people making the product. It's the same as other businesses now. They don't give a damn about those people. They only give a damn about what they can produce.
Yeah, I find it very hard to look at a lot of original streaming content these days. Personally, I find them sterile and cynical.
And predictable.
Yeah. They just you could be ticking off boxes while you're watching. They
Yeah.
don't. They just fill in a way. They're like a kind of fake meal.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah,
Astronaut food.
it's got people in it. It's got a story, and it's vapid. It doesn't. You're not really involved in it. I've seen very few films recently where I was invested in what was going on.
To go back a bit, I mean, you mentioned Bob Zemeckis and his embracing technology for his new film. He was always a bit ahead of the curve in terms of that. I think you not saying you did on purpose, but you didn't get involved in any of his motion capture exercises back in the day, and
No,
his more kind of so. But you were involved in one of the greatest trilogies of 80s cinema, which was Back to the Future, and you've said in your book it was interesting because you're watching people grow. I'd love to talk a little bit about that because we didn't talk about it as much in our last interview, and I know people would love to hear about it from the point of what it was like to make a film that suddenly became a trilogy, though it was never really part of the plan.
that's true. It was an amazing experience, and I also got to do the American part of Who Framed Roger Rabbit too, and that he was using different techniques. I mean, he had human beings interacting with cartoon characters that weren't there, and the cartoon characters are actually involving themselves in things that happened in the physical set and how to work that out. That was extremely interesting to watch Bob work with that and work it out. But Back to the Future, when I interviewed for the job and they outlined what it was, and they were so casual, these three guys, Bob Zemeckis, Bob Gale, Neil Canton, the interview seemed like they were testing my sense of humor. They said, why don't you get up on that conference table and show us how you assistant direct? And I thought they were joking. I mean, I wrote about this. I thought they were, I thought, what are they? You guys really are crazy, aren't you? And they laughed. So when we were making the first film, Back to the Future, we did get a feeling after Michael Fox started. That was the key moment in all three of those films, when Michael Fox became part of the show. The entire set mental state changed. It was literally like clicking on a bright light. He infused that part and infused the way the show ran with his personality and his intelligence and his youth, because he was doing Family Ties at the same time. He was sleeping in the back of a station wagon coming from Family Ties to do Back to the Future. And everybody who thought, oh man, we have to shoot 6 weeks of Back to the Future over again. And then Michael Fox would bounce out of a station wagon after a full day's work, run over, get changed, run out onto the set. And, okay, where are we? What's up, guys? Hi. Everybody thought, this is going to be fine. It doesn't matter that we have to do this stuff again. Look at this guy. If he can do it, what are we talking about? Let's do this.
Just to mark that for some people, Eric Stoltz was there for 6 weeks, working hard, and it wasn't really floating. It was a production issue with producers trying to push what they felt was their star, and everybody else not agreeing. The creatives, again, it's another example of creation versus money in a way.
That was the studio. That was Universal saying through Sid Sheinberg, they thought Eric was going to be a major star. They thought he would be perfect for the role. I found out afterward, I didn't know Bob well enough at the beginning to know that they had great reservations about it, but they ran out of time and money to find someone and had to start. And that they brought Eric on. Eric made everybody call him Marty. He was very method that way. And played the part with a great deal more angst than it needed. It became this kind of emotionally heavy kind of comedy. Michael Fox came in and made it look like as easy as breathing. He just came in, jump into the thing, hit a note, everybody just go, holy crap, you know, that was hilarious. How did, you know,
It
and
must
he'd
be
do it
quite
again.
surreal to see the same thing done twice and then feel it being so different.
And especially for the actors around him. I mean, I remember Tom Wilson talking about it, you know, that the difference between Michael Fox doing a reaction to something that he did and Eric Stoltz doing a reaction, he said it was just unbelievable. You know, it's just a wow, you know. Um, so that, as I say, infused the movie with something that it didn't have up to that point, and and Bob's attitude changed. He had his co-conspirators in the cast now. He still had trouble with Crispin Glover. Crispin Glover was his own boy and did scenes the way he thought they should be done, even when they differed from very specific directions from Bob. But you can't say that he doesn't come across on the screen. He did, you know, and
But the idea
he
of Crispin having to survive a whole shoot with Crispin Glover and Eric Stoltz would have killed everybody.
it was well, you know, honestly, it
Method
wasn't as
and Uber
overt.
method.
Yeah, but it wasn't as overt as that as I make it sound.
I
You know,
know,
it was
yeah.
all very subtle, very. I mean, things were, you know, we were still doing pretty good work. The dailies looked good, but when Michael started, it really did change the whole dynamic of everything. I
And as
mean,
you say, it's amazing how an actor can affect another actor. And then
oh
they give a
yes,
different performance as well.
oh yes, oh yes. I mean, that was, you know, part of the fun of seeing Michael come into the show. I mean, um, you know, Leah Thompson, Tom, as I say, um, and really the crew too. You know, we all, you know, now when we laughed at something, it was because it was pretty, you know, it was pretty outrageous. It was pretty funny. Um, so when you never know if you're going to make a hit, you know that, and everybody knows that. You don't know when you're doing these things, but you get a feeling about it. You get a momentum, you get a mood, you get, you know, you get a style going, and it works. So at the end of the film, we thought, well, okay, you know, that was good. When Back to the when we Bob called me to do Back to the Future 2, I was first of all really complimented. I didn't know, you know, I didn't know how I'd hit with them, and then suddenly, I think we'd been prepping for 2 weeks or something. Suddenly they said, guys, we're going to have to let you go for a while. Um, please don't take other jobs. We're going to be back, but we have to do something. We have to attend to something with the studio. They shut down. And what we didn't know was that Bob had gone to the studio and said, look, the script is too big. I have to make two movies. And the studio balked big time, and they had to do a timeout and go work it out. In the meantime, Bob did, I think, the second episode of Tales from the Crypt. I didn't know that he was an investor in it. You know, I mean, I don't have that business sense at all. But he said, hey guys, you know, and he took the whole crew over, the whole Back to the Future crew over, and did this TV episode of Tales from the Crypt. And we all got sick because we were using fake snow that was cotton or something, and it was floating around, and it got in everybody's lungs, and the ceilings were too low, and so the stage was overheated, and everybody on the crew got sick from this stuff. But anyway, suddenly the lights came back up on Back to the Future, and now instead of Back to the Future 2, it was Back to the Future 2, a 2-week shutdown, and Back to the Future 3 on location in Jamestown, California.
And it was done linear. It was the second one was made, went into post, and then shooting the third one while the second one was in post.
Yeah, Bob was literally flying at night from Sonora down to LA, sitting in the editing room at night, getting on a plane and coming back in the morning and coming down to the set. And he'd give us the night before, and he'd come in and change a few things, and we'd start shooting. He did that not all the time, but frequently enough where it became the norm. Um, nobody ever talks about that. How do you do two movies at once? You shoot one and you're editing one at the same time, in different locations in the state. Pretty impressive. Um, my favorite, and I literally had breakfast with Bob Gale yesterday, and we were talking. I have a wonderful relationship that is much better than when we were doing the film. I mean, we don't have the film overlay. We just are two people who like each other. And he was saying that, yeah, Back to the Future 3 is my favorite, and I said, me too. I loved being in a Western. He said, yeah, wasn't that, and it was like really being in a Western. That was the other thing on the Back to the Futures that was remarkably different. The set on Universal of Hill Valley Town Square and the coffee shop and the other places that were adjacent to it had a reality to it. You didn't look out and see, 1985 when we were shooting it. You saw the 1950s everywhere you looked. And then when we upgraded it to Back to the Future 2, you saw that time period and the Western town they built in the foothills outside Jamestown and Sonora. When you got out of the car and walked down this pathway and now you're in the set, the crew people looked out of place. It was so real. It had every facet of it. The saloon on the outside was the saloon on the inside. You walk in through the door, you're in an 1800s saloon. They had 1800s stagecoaches. They had old-time wranglers who were dressed up as background people, but they were the people that herded the horses around and got everything ready and hitched up the wagons, and it was unbelievable.
So was Spielberg a huge mentor for Bob and the Bobs at this stage?
I think so.
The initial argument over recasting, I don't think they would have won that battle without Spielberg.
I agree. I mean, they went to Spielberg first before they cut some film together on Back to the Future. The first one, took it to Steven, said, Steven, look at this with us. What do you think? And Steven said, it's not working. And said, that's what we think. And then they went to Scheinberg and the studio. So yes, but there became a point in the three films where Steven was no longer the mentor. Bob was his own man. Bob became the guy who knew what he wanted and knew how to do it and didn't really need Steven's input on that side of it. Steven would still show up every once in a while and he would, hang around the set and come and say hello to Bob. But the protection that Steven gave him was more as a studio umbrella, kind of thing.
Oh, you can see the confidence in the filmmaking from the very first film.
Yeah.
I mean, it is his second movie as director, isn't it?
No, I think he did Used Cars.
Yeah, and there was another one.
And there was another one.
The 60s pop movie, wasn't it?
Yes. I was going to say Stand By Me, but it's not. But it was something.
Yeah.
And then they'd written 1941 that Spielberg made.
Which I'm a fan of.
Well, it's a pretty crazy film. Yeah, it's pretty weird. And
Steven
they were not
Spielberg's
happy with the
version of It's a Mad, 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 Mad World.
Yes, yeah, I good one. But you could see as the films went on, Bob distanced himself from the onset Spielberg. The business side of Spielberg, he always kept open, but it became almost competitive after a while. I want to say it was subtle, but it was there. Bob was kind of, this.
I can imagine Spielberg would have been proud of making Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I think he would have liked it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they're both so smart, so they're not putting over anything on each other, but it was competitive in a kind of a good sense. And then if Steven got overbearing at points, Bob wouldn't pay attention to it. I think that's really kind of how it went. And it wasn't some big overt thing. I mean, these are all small things, and it's not some big deal. Um, but I admire Bob for the way he handled all of it, because there was a lot of pressure on those films, all of them for different reasons. On each film, there were different reasons where the pressure was strong, but it was always there. And I mean, imagine, your first film for Universal and under Spielberg's aegis, and now you want to start over again after 6 weeks of shooting. I mean, it takes balls, to even suggest it. Much less carry it off, and we did.
Well, again, he had a fantastic first AD. Let's not forget that.
Well, but I hesitate. I want to make sure that everybody understands that he had a crew that had done Romancing the Stone with him.
That's the movie I forgot.
All came over, and they all came over on Back to the Future. So they all had their shorthand with Bob worked out, and I came.
You were the new guy.
Yeah. And so I really held back for a long time. And by that, I mean most of the prep and the first week or so of shooting to understand how they all interacted before I started interposing, what I was doing on something that was working anyway, Well,
that's, isn't that brilliant? That says so much about you as a first AD. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and find out what you're dealing with before you deal with it.
Yeah, yeah. I spent a lot of time watching how he dealt with people, watching how he dealt with pressure, watching how he dealt with the ideas. He could visualize the entire film in his mind before he shot it. And I didn't understand how strong that was until partway into Back to the Future 2. I saw him do something, and I wrote about it, so I won't go through it, but a shot wasn't working. He walked away from the set and sat in a chair for a few minutes and came back and had worked it out. And I asked him about it afterward, and he said, I can close my eyes and see a scene I want to do as though it were showing on a screen in front of me. I can watch it like I've already shot it. I'd never heard anybody talk like that. And it doesn't mean that directors don't visualize in the same way, but I've never heard anybody say, I can close my eyes and like I'm seeing you here and the way you're reacting and everything, and I can imagine that and see it in front of me playing. What are you talking about? But on Back to the Future 3, he told me he'd visualized the whole movie before we shot it.
Did you find the energy kept all the way through all three films?
Yes. I mean, it had highs and lows. People were exhausted by the time we started Back to the Future 3. I remember there were people crying on the set off to the side when we started because nobody had recovered from Back to the Future 2. We had 12 weeks of nights on that and had to switch over back into days and finish it up. And, I think each film was around 100 shooting days. I mean, I was on Back to the Future 2 and 3 from October of one year to the full next year into, I think, the first few weeks of January in the third year. So that's a long stretch for two films.
Which was the most difficult of films to make? Was it the first one because it was a new thing, or was it? It seemed to be a lot more complexities of effects and production conundrums with the second film.
They all had their elements. I think Back to the Future 2 had one aspect of it that was very difficult was the motion control stuff that we used. In other words, that was the first time it had ever been used. They didn't even have a name for it. They called it the last name of the guy who invented it. So it was called the Tandro setup. Okay. And it was a guy named, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Tandro. And, that was where we had Tom Wilson playing a character in two different time periods, but in the same scene. But to do that, motion, the first motion control shots we did on the backlot, we had to nail these cameras down so that they were solid to the ground. We had to do the shot, both sides of the shot, in one day, because if you left it overnight, something could happen. And it did. We had one shot with Tom Wilson where we had to leave it and come back the next day because we couldn't finish the work. We came back the next day. There'd been a minor earthquake. We had to do the whole thing again, both sides, the A and B
So
side.
this will be footage where old Biff is going back to junior Biff and giving him a good
Yeah.
lecture. And
Yes, or listening in on something.
And the old-fashioned version was a split screen process where they try and manage the light and they shoot one side and then they shoot the other side and hopefully get the eye line right. So in this case, the camera was going to be moving and it was a sense of fluidity in the scene.
It wasn't. Some of them were still, but you had an A and a B side, right? But it was the same scene, same scenery. It was tricky. I mean, Dean Cundy, very unsung participant in these films, had a huge amount to do with being able to pace Bob on what he was doing. He understood animation when we did, who framed Roger Rabbit. He was a big fan of animation and stepped right into the complexities of that with Bob. A lot of cinematographers could not do that, and he was a very low key man. And was always kind of on top of his game, always was ready to try what Bob wanted to do and had experience with it. He was a huge advantage for Bob to have a man like that. And he didn't take up a lot of scenery, a lot of emotional stuff. He was very low key with Bob and stand off to the side with him, be quiet, had a great sense of humor. And the show needed all that.
You said in our last interview, you said a lovely thing. I thought it was very nice. You said like DOPs are wired to say yes.
Yeah. Well, he was one.
Yeah.
I mean, Bob would come out and say, "Hey, Dean, you think we could shoot the rehearsal?" And Dean would go, "It's always good to rehearse on film, Bob." Yeah. And all the crew would be looking at each other. Oh shit.
Can you remember anyone else that really stood out to you as a DOP that you were bowled over by? I know you worked with amazing people, including Gordon Willis. Was there anyone else besides those two guys?
John Seale, Australian, with all the attributes that the Australians have, which is a undertone sense of humor, very strong mindset, very. Kind of surprisingly strong. You didn't see it in the gentle, gentlemanly, humorous demeanor, but when things got tough, the toughest guy there was John Seale. And he was a wonderful man. He'd been. I met him on Witness, where he was Peter Weir's director of photography. He'd been the camera operator on The Year of Living Dangerously, I think, that Peter directed. And Peter, I can't remember if this was their first film together, but it was an early film that they did together. And then I worked with him on The Firm and Rain Man. All pretty different films. And he was always the master of it. He had he was a man of very few words when we were working. He wasn't a verbose person. He wasn't a star. He was always quiet, but very powerful with what he needed to have happen with his crew. I respected him highly. I always wanted to be better friends with him than I was able to be because we're both just too busy all the time, and I wasn't a person who hung out in the bars after shooting. I just didn't do that. He did. He was good at it. He made many friends that way and deepened a lot of his crew relationships that way. I was not that person. I always usually had to go and sit down.
Had a busy day.
Yeah, I gave it everything I had during the daylight.
What is the common quality you think that DOPs of that caliber have? Drives them. I mean, there are so many. I know there's a million different personalities. I think you didn't you work with Freddie Francis as well?
And he was an older man, unbelievable energy. Freddie Francis ran everybody on the crew into the ground, and he was in his 60s, I think. And he was subtle with what he was doing. He never made anything a big deal. Again, these guys, there's and he educated as he went along too, Freddie. I mean, I think I told you we were lighting a scene in the empty bedroom of a baby that had passed away, and he was lighting because a woman comes in and is remembering the child, and he was lighting it, and people were running around and everything, but he was standing alone in the set, and then he set a soft light above the crib, and took the amount of light down to just where you could barely perceive it with your eye. And it was his way of bringing the audience attention to the place where this woman's attention was in such a subtle way. And I asked him to tell me about why he was doing it. And that was why he was doing it, to bring, and he said, if I've done it right, you won't notice it, but subconsciously you will. And then that was the level he was working at, with stuff like that. And not slamming in a big key light and and these guys do stuff like that all through films. And a lot of times, even if you're on the set watching them, you don't even notice that they're doing these kinds of things that help the film in ways that are almost unknowable. I mean, Gordon Willis did it too. Gordon Willis would look through the eyepiece of the camera in a rehearsal, and there are crosshairs in the old camera things when you look through, and he would memorize where he wanted the crosshairs to be, and he put his camera operator and have them run a rehearsal and stand with his camera operator and tell him exactly where the crosshairs had to be at every point in the shot. And then he'd let the guy go and operate well. It was just like having a new pair of hands, right? And he had an operator who liked and respected Gordon enough to do exactly what Gordon did, with no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He just did what Gordon wanted. I mean, and you get to see this stuff going on. You get to, discover how these people work. And it's thrilling.